I'm Hermione Chambers. I'm 38 years old, a nonprofit executive, and to most people, I seem like the epitome of calm and competence. I wake up early every morning, before the city stirs, to review reports, plan meetings, and organize community projects. My job demands precision and empathy, and I take it all seriously, because I believe in making a difference. But the truth is, while I'm skilled at managing chaos at work, the chaos at home is something else entirely. It's a different kind of battle, one that never seems to end. My family is complicated. I have a sister, Miranda, who could charm the birds from the trees, but also carries a storm inside her. Our parents, Robert and Linda, have their own ways of dealing with tension, mostly by pretending it doesn't exist. And then there's me, the one who's always tried to hold the pieces together, the peacemaker, the silent buffer between explosive tempers and passive avoidance. At family dinners, there's always a delicate dance, a balancing act between civility and the simmering resentments lurking beneath polite smiles and careful words. The table is both a place for connection and a battleground. I've long been accustomed to the undercurrents. Miranda's cutting remarks disguised as jokes, my parents' averted gazes when conflict arises, the way my husband Ethan and daughter Julia sit quietly, caught in the middle. I try to be the voice of reason, the calming presence that keeps the dinner from devolving into another fight. The last family dinner, however, was different. We gathered as usual in the dining room of my childhood home, an elegant, if slightly worn house filled with echoes of the past. The table was set with my mother's china, candles flickering softly, the scent of roasted chicken mingling with a faint hint of lavender from the nearby garden. The conversation started lightly, with small talk about work, the weather, and Julia's upcoming school play. But beneath the surface, the tension was palpable, like a taut wire ready to snap. Miranda was there, as always, radiating that effortless charm that could disarm anyone. But I could see the sharp edge beneath her smile, the way her eyes flicked to me with something that wasn't quite sisterly affection. Our parents sat on either side of the table, Robert fiddling with his glass of wine, Linda smoothing her napkin, neither making eye contact with me. Ethan and Julia were beside me, their hands quietly intertwined, a silent show of support. The conversation shifted, as it always did, toward a subject I had tried to avoid: the family estate, the trust fund, the future. Miranda's tone became sharper, her words more pointed. I tried to deflect, to steer the dialogue toward safer ground, but the air thickened with unspoken accusations and old wounds. Then, in a moment that still haunts me, Miranda's hand shot out and slapped me hard across the face. The room froze. My cheek burned, not just from the sting but from the shock. I looked around, searching for any sign that someone would intervene, that someone would say something to stop the madness, but the silence was deafening. My parents looked away, unable or unwilling to act. Ethan's expression was tight with anger and helplessness. Julia's eyes welled up with tears, but she stayed quiet. Miranda's voice cut through the silence, cold and commanding. "Get out of my house." The words hit harder than the slap. They broke the fragile calm we all pretended to maintain. I stood there, trembling, feeling the weight of rejection settle deep within me. No one moved to stop her. No one said a word to comfort me. It was as if I had become invisible, an unwanted shadow in the family I had always tried to protect. That night, as I walked out into the cool night air, quiet and shaking, I realized that everything was about to change. The illusion of family peace had shattered, and whatever came next would force us all to confront the truth beneath the surface. From as far back as I can remember, Miranda was the favored daughter. Even as kids, the scales seemed tipped in her direction, effortlessly, like gravity pulling everything toward her orbit. She had this charisma that made people notice her, the kind of charm that turned heads and softened hearts. Teachers praised her for being outgoing and confident. Relatives gushed over her accomplishments and social ease. She was the bright star everyone wanted to bask in, while I was the steady, reliable moon, always there, but never quite the center of attention. Our parents, Robert and Linda, seemed to have reserved their warmth and admiration mainly for Miranda. It wasn't that they didn't love me, but their approval felt conditional, tied to how well I could keep the family running smoothly rather than any kind of celebration of who I was. I was the responsible one, the daughter who took care of problems, fixed what broke, and made sure the wheels kept turning without complaint. When Miranda dazzled at a school event or scored a promotion, she was the golden girl, the pride of the family. When I did well, graduated with honors, or earned a leadership role at work, it was met with polite nods, sometimes overshadowed by the latest drama Miranda stirred up. Miranda's successes always seemed bigger, louder, and more exciting. The family dinners were filled with stories of her latest adventure, her newest friend, or her latest social victory. I learned early that celebrating my own achievements invited subtle dismissal or awkward silences. "That's nice, Hermione, but don't forget to help with the dishes," my mother would say. Or my father might redirect the conversation to Miranda's upcoming charity gala, praising her natural gifts. It was as if my value was measured by my usefulness rather than my personhood. I remember the nights I stayed up late, poring over textbooks or work files, hoping that excelling might earn a shred of the attention I craved. But whenever I brought up my accomplishments, the conversation would veer off, or someone would deflect with a joke at my expense. "Typical Hermione, always taking things so seriously," Miranda would say with a smirk that barely hid her contempt. It stung, but I swallowed the hurt and forced a smile, telling myself it was just sibling rivalry. That family meant loving each other through imperfections. Behind the scenes, though, the reality was more complicated. Miranda's charm masked her entitlement, and she was skilled at twisting narratives to keep herself in the spotlight. If she needed a favor or wanted to avoid blame, she knew how to manipulate parents with a well-timed pout or a casual complaint. Our parents were quick to excuse her behavior, chalking it up to her personality or stress. "She's under a lot of pressure," they'd say, turning a blind eye to the mess she left behind. Meanwhile, I was expected to clean up, to apologize, to smooth over conflicts I hadn't caused. It became a pattern. Miranda would stir the pot, and I would be the one left to mop the floor. If a family event went wrong, if tension flared, or if someone felt slighted, I was the scapegoat, because I was the safe target, the one who wouldn't fight back. I tried to rationalize it all with the idea of loyalty. I believed that family meant unconditional support, that love required forgiveness. But each slight, each dismissal, chipped away at my hope. I remember one afternoon in my early 20s when I confided in my mother about how invisible I felt compared to Miranda. Her answer was a quiet, tired sigh. "Miranda has always been our bright star, Hermione. You're the steady one, the glue. We need you to hold things together." It felt like a consolation prize, a role I hadn't chosen but was expected to accept without question. My feelings were acknowledged only insofar as they served the family's stability. Miranda's success stories often masked the turmoil beneath the surface. Behind her dazzling smile were insecurities and a fierce need for control. I, on the other hand, learned to bury my own needs beneath layers of responsibility. I became the fixer, the peacemaker, the invisible pillar that kept the family upright while my own heart quietly frayed at the edges. Looking back, I realize how much those early years shaped the dynamic that would later explode in that family dinner room. The favoritism, the dismissals, the silent toleration of Miranda's manipulations, all laid the groundwork for the fractured relationships we have now. I was never just her sister. I was the backup plan, the safety net, the one expected to endure and forgive without question. And yet, despite all of it, I held on to hope. Hope that eventually, family loyalty and love would bridge the distance. I believed that if I kept being the responsible one, if I kept showing up and supporting them, the walls between us would crumble. But deep down, a quiet resentment took root, growing with each ignored plea for recognition, each unnoticed sacrifice. It was a slow burn that neither I nor anyone else dared acknowledge, until that night when the fragile facade finally shattered. Over the years, my role as the family's fixer became less of a choice and more of a burden I learned to carry almost instinctively. I remember countless evenings when I'd sit at my kitchen table after a long day at work, the glow of my laptop illuminating piles of bills or medical paperwork for my parents, while my mind raced through solutions for Miranda's latest crisis. She had a way of landing in trouble, whether it was a mounting credit card balance, a missed rent payment, or a job loss she never quite admitted to. Somehow, it always ended up on my shoulders to bail her out, financially and emotionally. There were nights when Ethan and I whispered in hushed tones about how we'd cover for Miranda again. "She'll figure it out eventually," I'd say to convince myself, though exhaustion tugged relentlessly at me. Julia, our daughter, would sometimes catch my tired eyes as I slipped money into an envelope for Miranda's overdue bills. She's a sensitive girl, and I worried about the silent weight she carried, seeing her mother stretched so thin but never complaining. My parents, Robert and Linda, grew older and more dependent with every passing year. Mom's arthritis worsened, making even simple tasks a challenge, and Dad's memory often faltered during conversations. I stepped in to coordinate doctor's appointments, manage medications, and keep track of their finances. The house needed constant upkeep, and family gatherings required careful planning to avoid triggering old arguments. It was a juggling act that left little room for my own needs. Despite the strain, I hosted family events with a quiet determination. Birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners, they were opportunities to keep the fragile peace alive. I'd spend hours cooking, cleaning, and setting the table just so, hoping that my efforts would create moments of unity, even if temporary. But often, Miranda would arrive late, chat loudly about herself, and leave early, leaving behind a trail of subtle criticisms. Our parents would half-heartedly praise her, while I found myself quietly wiping away crumbs and sweeping up after the guests had gone. The generosity I extended to Miranda and my parents wasn't just about money or time, it was about hope. I believed that by showing up again and again, by offering help without hesitation, I was sowing seeds of reciprocity and trust. Yet those seeds rarely took root. Miranda's thanks were sparse, more often replaced by entitlement or strategic silence. My parents' gratitude was often swallowed by their habitual denial of family conflict, as if acknowledging the fractures would somehow unravel the identity they clung to. Ethan witnessed this toll in quiet moments. After particularly difficult visits home, he'd pull me aside, concern etched on his face. "You're carrying too much," he'd say gently. "You need to think about yourself too." But I brushed off his worries with a practiced smile, convinced that my sacrifices were what held our family together. Julia, ever perceptive, occasionally asked why we never talked about Miranda's behavior or why I seemed tired all the time. I'd tell her, "Sometimes family means making tough choices and putting others first." It was a lonely role, invisible yet essential. I remember one Thanksgiving when Miranda arrived with a new boyfriend, loud and dismissive, barely acknowledging the meal I'd prepared. Later, she complained loudly about the food and questioned why I'd invited some distant relatives who didn't fit her social circle. My parents simply nodded, avoiding eye contact with me as if I didn't exist. That night, I forced myself to smile through the hurt, telling myself that these moments were the price of peace. Financially, the strain was real and persistent. I covered Miranda's rent several times when she claimed to be between jobs, fronted medical bills for Mom's treatments, and even lent Dad money to fix his car without expecting repayment. My own savings dwindled quietly, and yet I never voiced complaints. Inside, I cataloged each sacrifice carefully, hoping that someday it would be seen not as obligation, but as love. But instead, my efforts were treated as normal, expected even. In those years, I realized that my family didn't see me as an equal or as someone whose needs mattered. I was a caretaker, a safety net, a fallback plan, and yet no one considered how fragile that net was becoming. I juggled exhaustion and resentment, hoping that my dedication would eventually bridge the widening gap between us all. Looking back now, I can see how those years of giving without receiving laid the groundwork for the rupture that would come, a rupture that began with Miranda's slap and the cold command to leave. But at this point, still deep in that cycle of sacrifice, I was holding on to hope. Even when I felt invisible, I believed that my presence, my support, was the glue keeping my family from falling apart completely. I told myself that if I just tried harder, if I continued to give without complaint, the love and recognition I craved would finally come. Little did I know that hope was the thread that would unravel everything. I always believed that when I poured my heart into something meaningful and visible, it would earn me a little respect, maybe even admiration. So when I decided to organize the charity gala, I was determined to make it not only a success, but a symbol of what I could do beyond the invisible roles I was assigned in my own family. Months went into planning every detail, securing sponsors, coordinating volunteers, lining up speakers, and making sure the evening flowed flawlessly. This wasn't just another event to me. It was my chance to stand out on my own terms. The night of the gala arrived with that electric mix of excitement and nerves. The venue was a beautifully restored ballroom, shining under crystal chandeliers, filled with guests dressed in their finest. I scanned the crowd, spotting familiar faces from the nonprofit world, local officials and community leaders who had come to support the cause. Ethan, ever my steady anchor, squeezed my hand briefly as we mingled, and Julia, dressed in a simple but elegant dress, sat quietly with a proud smile. I moved through the crowd, greeting guests, making introductions, and listening intently to the stories shared about the people our programs had helped. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. I felt a surge of pride when several donors complimented me on the organization and smooth running of the evening. For once, I wasn't just Hermione, the responsible one or the background fixer. I was the driving force, the face of success. But then, in the midst of the evening's speeches, my sister Miranda made her entrance. She arrived fashionably late, as always, draped in designer clothes and sparkling jewelry, the kind of presence that commanded a room. The crowd's attention shifted immediately, and for a moment, I felt the familiar sharp edge of invisibility creeping back under the spotlight. Miranda had an uncanny ability to make everything about her, even if she had nothing to do with it. When it was her turn to speak, unexpectedly, as I hadn't planned for her to have a role, her words cut through the evening like a blade. She began by praising our parents, especially Dad, crediting them for the family's success and their commitment to charity work. Her voice was smooth and confident, but the subtext was unmistakable. She was positioning herself as the true heir to the family's legacy, while subtly diminishing my efforts. And of course, Miranda said, her eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and disdain, Hermione's involvement has been, well, let's just say a bit overbearing at times, always trying to control everything, making sure everyone's doing it right. She smiled thinly, as if dropping a well-timed joke, but the sting was immediate. The room grew uncomfortably quiet for a moment. I felt my face flush, not with embarrassment, but with a profound sense of betrayal. My parents sat there, their expressions unreadable, neither defending me nor acknowledging Miranda's pointed jab. Dad sipped his wine, avoiding my gaze, while Mom busily rearranged her napkin, eyes fixed downward. The silence from them was a louder condemnation than any words could have been. Ethan's jaw clenched beside me. "Ignore her," he whispered softly, but his voice carried the tension we both felt. Julia's hand found mine, her fingers trembling slightly. I squeezed back, trying to steady us both. I wanted to speak up, to stand my ground and reclaim the moment I had worked so hard for, but the words caught in my throat. Miranda's smirk grew wider, sensing the effect she had. The guests exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh it off or intervene. I realized painfully that this wasn't just about a teasing remark. It was a public dismissal of everything I had done quietly, without fanfare, in the shadows of my sister's spotlight. For a brief moment, I questioned myself. Had I been too controlling, too exacting? But deep down, I knew the truth. This was less about my behavior and more about Miranda's need to undermine me, to keep me in my place. The charity gala was supposed to be my triumph, but instead, it became a stage for Miranda's subtle cruelty. As the evening progressed, I found myself retreating inward, my smile forced, and my enthusiasm dimmed. I noticed how our parents continued to side with Miranda through their silence and inaction. They never once reached out to affirm my work or challenge her narrative. Instead, they seemed to accept her version as the truth, reinforcing the family dynamic where my efforts were invisible and my worth questioned. Driving home that night, the gala's glittering lights blurred past the car windows, mirroring the turmoil I felt inside. I wrestled with a familiar ache, the sting of public humiliation mixed with the quiet devastation of being dismissed by the very people I had devoted myself to supporting. It was a moment that left a crack in the foundation of my hope, a crack that would soon widen, threatening to bring everything down. Yet even in that hurt, I clung to a fragile hope. Maybe this was just one bad night, one misstep in a complicated family dance. Maybe Miranda's jealousy would pass, and my parents would recognize the truth eventually. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it would grow, feeding the fire that was already simmering beneath the surface of our fragile family ties. That family dinner started like any other, an uneasy ritual we all endured. The dining room table, polished but worn, bore the weight of years of tension and unsaid words. The air was thick with the scent of roasted chicken and herbs, a smell that should have been comforting, but instead felt like the backdrop for a silent war. I sat there, flanked by Ethan and Julia, my heart pounding with a mix of exhaustion and dread. Across from me, Miranda's eyes gleamed with a cold fire I had learned to recognize but never fully prepare for. The conversation circled around the usual topics: work, the kids, the weather, but the underlying current was unmistakable. When the family trust came up, the tension snapped tighter. Miranda's voice sharpened. She leaned forward, her words laced with accusation and entitlement. I tried to keep my tone steady, deflecting, hoping to avoid a confrontation that I sensed was inevitable. But she wasn't interested in diplomacy. Her smile twisted into something bitter, her eyes locking onto mine as if daring me to speak. Then, in a heartbeat, her hand flew across the table and struck my cheek with a force that echoed in the silence. The slap was sharp, burning, a physical punctuation to years of silent battles and unseen wounds. Time seemed to slow, the room freezing around me as shock rippled through every face. My cheek throbbed, but the pain wasn't just physical. It was the raw sting of betrayal from someone who should have been family. I looked around, desperate for a lifeline, for someone, anyone, to break the silence. But my parents sat rigid, their eyes fixed elsewhere, unwilling or unable to intervene. Robert's jaw tightened as he stared at the table, and Linda's hands trembled faintly in her lap, but neither moved to stop Miranda or comfort me. Their silence was deafening, a tacit endorsement of Miranda's cruelty. Ethan's face was tight with anger and helplessness, his grip on Julia's hand firm but unable to shield us from the storm. Julia's eyes shimmered with tears, but she stayed quiet, caught between fear and sorrow. Miranda's voice cut through the stillness, cold and commanding. "Get out of my house." Those words were like a blade, carving a space where I no longer belonged. The command wasn't just about physical space. It was a rejection of everything I had been for this family. The caregiver, the peacemaker, the invisible support. I stood there, trembling, my mind reeling from the shock and the sharp clarity that came with it. This wasn't just a moment of anger. It was a declaration of war. As I gathered myself to leave, the weight of that rejection settled deep into my bones. The house that had once been my refuge now felt like a cage, the walls closing in with memories of years spent trying to keep the family afloat. I could still feel the echo of Miranda's slap on my skin, a cruel reminder of how far things had fallen. Not a single voice rose to defend me, not a hand reached out to pull me back. Later that night, as I walked into the cool silence of the night, the world around me sharp and clear in contrast to the turmoil inside, I realized the fracture that slap had torn through our family was far more than skin deep. It was a rupture I could no longer ignore, not just between Miranda and me, but between everything I believed family should be. The next day, the betrayal deepened when I discovered Miranda had secretly persuaded Dad to cut me and Julia out of the family trust. The financial exclusion was a cold, deliberate blow, proof that her vendetta was not just emotional but calculated. It was a line crossed that demanded reckoning. I sat alone in the quiet of my home, the weight of that knowledge pressing down, the fragile hope I clung to dissolving into a harsh reality. That slap, those words, the silence that followed, it all marked a turning point. The family I had tried so hard to hold together had turned its back on me. The reckoning had begun, and I knew I could no longer be the quiet victim of their cruelty. The night air was cold as I stepped away from that house, but inside, a fire was kindling, one fueled by betrayal, hurt, and a growing resolve that nothing would ever be the same again. In the days that followed that shattering night, grief settled over me like a thick fog, heavy and suffocating. But as the initial shock began to wear off, that grief slowly morphed into something colder, sharper, a clarity I hadn't dared to face before. I sat alone in the quiet corners of my home, replaying every moment, every interaction, every unspoken word that had led to this fracture. It was like peeling back layers of a long-hidden wound, and what I uncovered was raw and undeniable. For years, I had been the family's invisible caretaker, the one who took the blows, who smoothed the chaos, who sacrificed pieces of herself so the rest could thrive. And yet, all along, I had been quietly dismissed, overlooked, and, most cruelly, taken for granted. I thought back to all the times I had been the backbone, the unacknowledged anchor holding everything together. I remembered how I had managed every family crisis with a steady hand, covering Miranda's mounting debts when no one else would step up, scheduling doctor's appointments for Mom when her arthritis flared, juggling work deadlines while coordinating dinner parties that masked the simmering tension beneath polite smiles. Those late nights spent balancing checkbooks and calming tempers, while forcing myself to smile through exhaustion. How Ethan had silently handed me cups of tea in the quiet hours, his eyes full of worry, knowing I was stretched too thin but unsure how to help. How Julia, despite her tender age, had sensed the invisible weight I bore and clung tightly to me as if anchoring herself in the storm. And yet, every sacrifice, every moment of care, seemed to vanish into thin air. Miranda's entitlement was never challenged. It was excused away as just her nature. Our parents never saw me as more than the dutiful daughter who cleaned up after Miranda's messes and kept the family machinery running. Their eyes glossed over when I tried to speak up about being hurt or ignored. "You're too sensitive," or "Family's complicated. Just let it go," were the refrains. The mantra of family first echoed hollowly through the years, a phrase that had come to mean one-sided loyalty, where I gave and they took. I remember the sharp sting of countless silent dinners, where my words were drowned beneath Miranda's laughter, or my parents' polite disinterest. I cataloged each dismissal, each overlooked achievement, each thankless task I had taken on without complaint. The mental ledger grew long and heavy. How many times had I swallowed my pride to keep the peace? How many times had I chosen silence over confrontation, hoping that love would fill the gaps? The answer was painfully clear. Love had been conditional, measured not by respect or kindness, but by convenience and entitlement. As I sat with this realization, a cold resolve began to form inside me, a quiet fire of self-preservation and justice. I was not a doormat to be pushed aside. I was not invisible. The family's cruelty was not a reflection of my worth, but of their own failures to see me as an equal, as a person deserving of respect. The betrayal was deeper than that slap, deeper than Miranda's harsh words. It was the cumulative weight of years of dismissal and disregard. This awakening was neither sudden nor explosive. It was a steady, unyielding shift in my spirit. I understood that the family's patterns would not change unless I forced them to confront their own complicity. The pain hardened into determination. If they wanted to treat me like a stranger, to exclude me and Julia from our birthright, then I would no longer play the role they assigned me. I owed them nothing, not blind loyalty, not silence, not sacrifice. The house that had once felt like home now felt alien, a place where I had been unwelcome for far too long. But I also saw that this alienation was, strangely, a gift. It freed me from the suffocating expectation to endure harm for the sake of family peace. I could reclaim my dignity, set boundaries, and demand accountability. In the quiet moments, when the world outside seemed indifferent to my pain, I began to sketch out what that might look like. Not just for me, but for Julia too. I thought about shielding her from the toxic undercurrents I had endured, about building a life where respect was not optional. The future stretched uncertain before me, but for the first time in a long time, it held a flicker of hope. Not a hope born of denial or wishful thinking, but one grounded in truth and resolve. I knew the path ahead would not be easy, that pushing back against years of entrenched dysfunction would stir up storms, but the alternative, continuing to be the family's invisible caretaker while my own spirit withered, was no longer acceptable. The reckoning was beginning, and I was ready. In the quiet aftermath of that night, as the adrenaline faded and the sting of betrayal settled into a dull ache, I found myself retreating to the small sanctuary of my home office. The soft glow of my desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over the scattered papers and unopened mail that had begun to pile up. It was there, in the stillness, that I finally allowed myself to confront the reality I had been avoiding for so long. This wasn't just a momentary rupture. It was a fundamental fracture in the family's foundation, and it demanded a response far beyond tears or whispered hopes. I began by taking stock of everything, the invisible ways in which the family relied on me and the fragile threads that had kept them tethered. My financial support was one of the most tangible. Countless times I had stepped in to cover Miranda's mounting debts, fronted payments for my parents' medical bills, and quietly propped up shared expenses. I sifted through bank statements, tracking transfers I'd made in the dead of night, bracing myself for the full scope of what I had given. It was a ledger of sacrifice that I had buried beneath layers of obligation and love, but now it felt like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to my own exhaustion. Beyond the numbers, I reflected on the caregiving role I had assumed, almost without question. Mom's arthritis had worsened, making simple tasks unbearable for her, and Dad's fading memory meant I was often the voice of reason, the scheduler of appointments, and the guardian of medication routines. I was the one who drove them to doctors, who managed the chaos of prescriptions and therapies. The house itself was a monument to my labor. Repairs arranged, bills paid, emergencies handled, all while maintaining the illusion that everything was fine. I realized how deeply entwined my presence had become with the family's day-to-day survival. Shared assets were another domain where I held quiet control, often without the family fully appreciating it. I managed the paperwork for the estate, communications with lawyers and financial advisors, and kept track of investments more out of necessity than any desire for power. It was a role I had taken on to ease the burden on my aging parents and to protect Julia's future. But in this new light, it felt less like a gift and more like a responsibility that had become a chain binding me to a family that no longer respected me. As these truths crystallized, I realized that my survival, and Julia's, depended on safeguarding what was rightfully ours. The first step was legal. Quietly, without fanfare or warning, I reached out to a lawyer with expertise in family trusts and estate law. I explained the situation carefully, laying out the betrayal and the exclusion from the family trust, and asked her to review all documents thoroughly. There was a cold satisfaction in knowing that this time, the power would be in my hands, that I could protect what Miranda and my parents had tried to strip away without consequence. Simultaneously, I began documenting every interaction with increasing precision. I recorded phone calls when Miranda's voice turned sharp or threatening, saved text messages where my parents skirted responsibility or ignored my pleas, and kept detailed notes of every family meeting or event. This was not about revenge. It was about accountability. I needed evidence. A clear record that would stand up if this fractured family dynamic spilled into a legal battle or needed to be confronted publicly. For the first time, my meticulous nature, so often a source of quiet frustration, became my strongest ally. Despite the undercurrent of turmoil, I maintained a composed exterior at family gatherings. I attended events, exchanged pleasantries, and answered questions with carefully measured calm. No one suspected the storm brewing beneath my poised surface. My silence was strategic. I refused to be baited or pushed into emotional outbursts that would only reinforce the old narrative of me as difficult or controlling. Instead, I listened, observed, and let their assumptions about my compliance work against them. But inside, I was withdrawing. The phone calls I returned immediately before were now answered on my own terms or not at all. Invitations I once accepted as obligations were declined with careful excuses. I was reclaiming time and energy that had been siphoned away by endless caregiving and financial support. Each boundary I set was a quiet rebellion, a line drawn in the sand to protect my dignity and the well-being of my family. The most difficult part was shifting my identity from the ever-available peacemaker to someone who could say no without guilt. It felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory, where empathy and toughness had to coexist. I grappled with waves of doubt and loneliness, knowing that my choices would provoke resistance and possibly deepen the family's fracture. But beneath it all was a fierce determination. I would no longer be the invisible cornerstone, silently bearing the weight of their dysfunction. In this phase of planning, I recognized that the path forward required patience and precision. There was no room for rash decisions or emotional recklessness. Instead, I had to be methodical, to prepare a response that would not just reactive, but transformative, one that would demand respect and force accountability. This was a reckoning, but also a reclamation. As the days passed, I felt the embers of resolve grow stronger. The quiet work behind closed doors was shaping a new reality, one where I was no longer invisible, no longer the default caretaker, and no longer willing to be dismissed. The family's dependence on me had been a hidden vulnerability, and now it was mine to control. The stage was set. What happened next would change everything. The shift began with something as subtle as a delayed reply to a text message. Where I used to respond promptly, especially to calls from Miranda or our parents, I started to take my time. Sometimes I let calls go to voicemail, only returning them hours later or the next day. The silence was a small assertion, but felt enormous in the context of years spent being instantly available. At first, Miranda barely noticed. She was used to having me on speed dial, always ready to untangle whatever mess she'd made. But as days passed, the pattern became undeniable. Calls went unanswered longer, texts were met with clipped replies, and invitations that once felt obligatory were met with polite but firm refusals. When Miranda called one afternoon, her tone sharp and impatient, demanding help with a bill she claimed was urgent, I didn't rush to rescue her. Instead, I said firmly, "I'm sorry, but that's something you'll have to manage yourself." The words felt strange on my tongue, heavy with a new strength I hadn't allowed myself before. She pushed back, her voice rising, but I held my ground. It was a small resistance, but it marked a turning point. The invisible boundary was drawn. Financially, I began tightening control with deliberate care. I changed passwords on joint accounts shared with Miranda and our parents, securing access only for Ethan and myself. It was a quiet act of protection for Julia's inheritance and my own peace of mind. Beyond passwords, I updated legal documents, powers of attorney, beneficiary designations, and wills, ensuring that any future decisions would require my involvement and consent. The lawyer I hired worked discreetly, aware of the delicate family dynamics at play. At family gatherings, my presence remained calm and composed, but my emotional investment waned. When Miranda made her usual snide remarks or tried to draw me into old arguments, I responded with measured politeness or silence. Invitations to weekend brunches or holiday events were sometimes declined with gentle excuses, work deadlines, prior commitments, or simply needing rest. It was a reclaiming of space I'd long sacrificed, a quiet withdrawal from the emotional and logistical labor that had defined my family role. Behind the scenes, I was gathering evidence. Text messages where Miranda's tones turned insistent or cruel were saved. Emails showing our parents' passive complicity were organized into folders. I kept detailed notes, dates, times, conversations. Each entry a piece of the puzzle that exposed the family's fractured trust. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth and protection. I needed to prove that my boundaries were not arbitrary, but a necessary response to years of neglect and abuse. Miranda, of course, noticed the changes. Her charm gave way to frustration and then to anger. When my calls went unanswered or help was denied, she lashed out with accusations of betrayal and selfishness, trying to provoke a reaction. But I refused to engage on her terms. Ethan stood by me quietly, supporting my decisions even when the family drama crested into waves of conflict. Julia watched from the sidelines, sensing the tension, yet finding comfort in our small, steadfast family unit. The family, meanwhile, seemed confused by my withdrawal. My parents asked gentle questions but never confronted me directly. Their denial hung in the air like a thick fog. They preferred the old story, where I was always available, always forgiving. But I was no longer playing that part. Each subtle refusal, each delayed response was a message. I was no longer the family's safety net. This slow, deliberate retreat unsettled the fragile balance. It exposed how much they had depended on my willingness to absorb their dysfunction without complaint. The quiet rebellion I enacted was not loud or confrontational, but it was no less powerful. It challenged the unspoken rules that had kept me in a secondary role for so long. And as I maintained this distance, I felt an unfamiliar sensation: relief. The absence of immediate demands, the space to breathe, think, and plan. These were gifts I hadn't realized I'd been denied. For Julia, it meant a home less shadowed by drama, and for Ethan and me, a chance to focus on healing and building a future without the constant weight of family crisis. Yet beneath this calm exterior, I was preparing for the moment when these subtle moves would no longer suffice, that the family would be forced to face the consequences of their choices. The package of legal documents, proof of manipulations, and a firm letter of boundaries was still to come. But the groundwork was laid, and the family's illusions had begun to crack. Every phone call returned late, every invitation declined, every locked account was a quiet hammer striking at the walls of old entitlement and denial. The story was shifting, and I was no longer the background character in a drama written by others. I was taking control step by step, setting the stage for a reckoning that no one could ignore. 1 week after that night, the night when Miranda's slap echoed louder than any words, I stood in my quiet living room, the soft hum of the city outside a stark contrast to the storm swirling inside me. The package sat on the table before me, carefully assembled, its weight heavier than any physical object could be. Inside, I had gathered everything that would lay bare the truth my family had tried so desperately to hide. Legal documents that stripped Miranda of her control, undeniable evidence of her lies and manipulations, and my carefully crafted letter spelling out the boundaries I could no longer let them cross. That letter was the hardest part. Every word was chosen with precision. No emotion-laden pleas, no begging for recognition, just clear, firm statements. I had written, "Get out, now." 3 words that carried the weight of years of betrayal, pain, and silent endurance. They marked the final line in the sand, drawn not out of anger alone, but from a place of deep self-respect. It was the voice I had kept silent for so long, now impossible to ignore. The package was wrapped in plain brown paper, unassuming but deliberate. No decoration, no flourish, because this was not a gift. It was a reckoning. I wanted my parents to open it and feel the gravity of what they had allowed to happen, what they had enabled in their silence. I wanted Miranda to see that her manipulation, her cruelty, was not invisible anymore. This was more than just legal paperwork. It was a mirror held up to the family's fractured heart. I remember the sharp intake of breath as I sealed the envelope containing the letter. The paper was thick, the ink crisp. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the surge of resolve that had built up over weeks. It was a physical manifestation of something intangible, the reclaiming of my voice, my power, my dignity. That afternoon, I drove to their house, the place where the slap and those cold words had shattered any illusion of peace. The garden was blooming with late spring flowers, the same ones I had once tended alongside Mom when we were girls. Now, they seemed like silent witnesses to all the unspoken pain. I placed the package against the front door, careful to leave it somewhere visible, but not intrusive. As I stepped back, my heart hammered fiercely. I knew the impact this would have. This was no quiet withdrawal or passive protest. It was a confrontation, a demand for recognition and change that could not be ignored. The weight of years of invisibility, of carrying burdens no one acknowledged, was now laid bare. I didn't wait around to see who might answer the door. I turned and left, the dusk wrapping around me like a cloak. The evening air was cool and sharp, but for the first time in a long time, the chill held a promise of clarity rather than despair. I was no longer the silent caretaker, the background figure smoothing over cracks that only deepened with time. Back home, I settled in with Ethan and Julia, trying to act normal, but beneath the surface, tension thrummed like an electric current. The family had no idea what was coming. They hadn't seen the lawyer's letters, the changes to the trust documents that legally removed Miranda's control. They didn't know that I had revoked my role as caregiver to Mom, handing over the responsibilities I'd borne alone for so long. They were about to face a new reality, one where their usual safety net was gone. That night, the silence in our home felt different. It was not the quiet before another storm of family discord, but the stillness before a reckoning. The package was a catalyst, a signal that the status quo was over. I knew they would scramble. Calls, visits, protestations, but this time, I was ready. My calm was not resignation. It was the solid ground beneath a foundation I was rebuilding. I thought about the evidence I had included. Detailed records of Miranda's manipulations, text messages where she threatened me, correspondence where my parents excused her behavior with empty platitudes. This was not just about me. It was about exposing a pattern of deceit and entitlement that had poisoned our family dynamic for years. In my mind, I heard Miranda's sharp voice, the smugness behind her words, the way she always expected to be unchallenged. This package was the first real challenge she would face, and my parents, the ones who had turned away when I needed them most, would have to reckon with their complicity. The fragile facade they maintained was cracking, and I was the one holding the hammer. As the hours passed, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. Fear, because I knew the fallout could be brutal. Exhilaration, because for the first time in years, I was no longer trapped in the shadows of their dysfunction. I had taken the first decisive step toward reclaiming my life, my family, and my peace. The package sitting at their door was more than just a collection of papers. It was a declaration. I would no longer be invisible. I would no longer tolerate betrayal. And I was done being the family's silent victim. What would happen next? I didn't know. But I was ready for the storm, and ready to stand my ground. The fallout from that package was immediate and undeniable. Within days, my parents' carefully maintained world began unraveling in ways they hadn't anticipated, nor prepared for. The quiet support I had provided for years was suddenly gone, and the consequences struck hard and fast. Overdue bills began piling up on their kitchen counter, unopened and forgotten, the once meticulous payment schedule reduced to chaos. Medical appointments that I had been managing for Mom, reminders called, rides arranged, prescriptions refilled, were missed or postponed. The cracks in their independence suddenly became chasms, exposing how reliant they had become on me without ever admitting it. I heard about it through a mixture of thinly veiled whispers and blunt confrontations. My mother, usually so composed and reserved, was overwhelmed by the mounting challenges. She left dozens of missed calls on my phone, 45 in total, each one a desperate plea, begging me to come back, to forgive, to undo the damage. Her voicemails were tearful, some shaky with fear, others tangled with regret. "Hermione, please, it was all a mistake. We don't want to lose you." The desperation in her voice cut through me, but I stayed silent, holding firm to the boundaries I had set. I knew forgiveness had to come with accountability, and this was not a mistake that could simply be erased by a few tearful calls. Miranda's world crumbled in parallel, but in a very different way. The socialite image she'd cultivated for years, effortless charisma, glamorous parties, influential connections, began to show cracks. Word spread quickly through her carefully curated circle, whispers in exclusive cafes, muffled gossip at charity events, and pointed looks at the clubs she frequented signaled her sudden fall from grace. People who had once sought her favor now hesitated to invite her, their smiles polite but distant. I watched from afar as the golden child's mask faltered, revealing the vulnerable woman beneath, one who had grown accustomed to being untouchable, suddenly facing consequences she couldn't charm her way out of. Miranda's responses were a volatile mix of fury and desperation. At first, she lashed out, texts filled with accusations, calls where her voice trembled between rage and pleading. "You're ruining everything," she screamed once, before the line went dead. Then came the tears, the midnight messages begging for a second chance, for the family to come back together like we used to be. But I had heard those pleas before, and I recognized the patterns. This time, I refused to let myself be manipulated. The cycle of apology followed by betrayal was over. My father, ever the stoic figure, seemed lost. He was no longer the commanding presence I remembered from my childhood, but a man grappling with the reality of his own neglect. Overdue notices piled up unopened, and his usual distractions, newspapers, golf, business news, no longer masked the growing strain. I caught glimpses of his frustration when he thought no one was watching. Clenched fists, a hard swallow, eyes distant as he tried to make sense of the chaos his silence had enabled. Yet he never reached out to me, never attempted to bridge the gap he had ignored for so long. The family's fragile equilibrium shattered, and with it, their ability to maintain the facade of normalcy. Neighbors and acquaintances began to notice the shift. Invitations to social gatherings stopped coming for Miranda, while my parents' usual polite smiles faded into tense nods and hurried excuses. The once glowing Chambers' reputation, built on wealth, charm, and carefully maintained appearances, now flickered under the weight of whispered rumors and tenuous alliances. Through it all, I stayed resolute. When my mother's missed calls flooded my phone, I silenced the notifications, but did not block her. I wanted her to know I was there, but only on terms of respect and honesty. When Miranda's frantic messages appeared, I read them carefully, choosing not to respond. My husband Ethan stood by me quietly, offering unwavering support while respecting my decision to enforce distance. Julia, sensing the storm from her own quiet vantage point, clung to me more tightly, her eyes searching mine for reassurance that we were safe. The divide was wider than ever, but beneath the chaos, a new clarity emerged. I saw the consequences of years of denial and entitlement laid bare before me, not just in missed bills or shattered social circles, but in the raw vulnerability of those who had taken me for granted. Their panic was real, their losses palpable, but so was my resolve. I was no longer the invisible glue, no longer willing to absorb the damage so they could maintain their illusions. The silence from my side spoke volumes. It was a boundary made manifest, a message that respect and accountability were not optional. The family had a choice: confront the consequences of their actions or continue down a path that would only lead to further fragmentation. And as the days passed, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and strength ripple through me. Sorrow for the family I had loved and lost, strength from the knowledge that I had finally reclaimed my voice and my power. The story was far from over. In fact, it was only just unfolding. The fallout from my decision rippled through the Chambers family like a shockwave. The fragile balance that had barely held us together for so many years shattered under pressure, and their dysfunction deepened in ways that felt both inevitable and devastating. Without my steady hand managing their affairs, things quickly spiraled out of control. I heard about the mounting troubles in bits and pieces, through strained phone calls from my mother, hushed conversations overheard from neighbors, and even from Miranda's increasingly frantic messages that I chose not to answer. The house that once seemed like a sanctuary, the place where I had spent countless hours caring for and supporting my parents, became a scene of growing chaos. Overdue bills piled up in disorganized stacks on the kitchen counter, ignored and unpaid. The neat calendar I had maintained for Mom's medical appointments was suddenly blank or filled with crossed-out dates, forgotten or missed entirely. I imagined Mom sitting there, helpless and overwhelmed, facing the mounting confusion and frustration without the support she had come to rely on, even if she never fully appreciated it. Miranda's carefully crafted social image began to crumble, too. The dazzling charm and confidence she wore like armor started to crack under the weight of whispered gossip and veiled snubs. Her usual haunts, the upscale boutiques, charity galas, and exclusive clubs, felt colder, less inviting. A subtle shift had occurred. People who once flocked to her side now offered polite but distant greetings, their smiles tight and eyes wary. Those who once sought to bask in her reflected glory quietly stepped back, sensing the change. I could almost hear the quiet murmurs behind closed doors, the speculation about what had happened to the golden girl who had always seemed untouchable. Miranda's reaction was volatile and raw. Initially, her messages were a mix of fury and desperation. A tempest of accusations hurled my way, claiming I was tearing the family apart, that I was selfish and cruel. I remember one particularly heated call where her voice cracked with anger and hurt, shouting, "You're ruining everything we've built! You're destroying us!" before slamming the phone down. Then came the tears, the midnight texts, the sobbing voicemails, the desperate pleas begging for forgiveness and a return to the way things used to be. But I had heard those words before, empty promises wrapped in manipulation. This time, I was resolute. I refused to give in to the cycle of apology followed by betrayal. My father, once the stoic patriarch, the man whose commanding presence had shaped my childhood, seemed diminished and lost. I caught glimpses of his frustration during rare moments when he thought no one was watching, clenched fists trembling slightly, a hard swallow as he stared blankly at overdue notices and mounting letters. But he never reached out to me, never tried to bridge the widening chasm. His silence felt like a surrender, a quiet acknowledgement that the comfortable denial he had maintained was finally unraveling. The dysfunction didn't stay hidden behind closed doors. It spilled out, fracturing the family's carefully curated public image. Invitations to social events for Miranda dried up. Old friends and acquaintances began avoiding the Chambers name, wary of the turmoil. My parents' polite smiles turned brittle, their conversations with neighbors becoming curt and strained. The once unshakable facade of wealth and charm flickered, revealing the cracks beneath the surface. Rumors began to circulate, subtle yet damaging, whispers that poisoned reputations and alliances. The Chambers name, once synonymous with success and grace, now carried a hint of scandal and sorrow. Amid all this, I remained firm in my resolve. My phone flooded with desperate messages from Mom. 45 missed calls in one day alone. Her voice messages trembled with regret and fear, each one begging for forgiveness, for reconciliation, for me to undo the damage I had wrought by standing up for myself. "Hermione, please, it was all a mistake. We don't want to lose you," she whispered, her words breaking through my heart. Yet I did not respond. Not yet. I needed her to understand that love without respect was hollow, that forgiveness required change. Miranda's frantic attempts to regain control were met with my silence. No matter how much she screamed or cried, I held firm. The golden child's mask cracked, revealing vulnerability and panic. The power she once wielded so effortlessly slipped through her fingers, and for the first time, she faced consequences she couldn't charm away. Ethan stood by me quietly through it all, his steady presence a balm against the storm. Julia, sensing the upheaval yet shielded by our small family unit, clung to me with wide eyes, looking for reassurance that we were safe. The chasm between us and the family grew wider each day, but beneath the chaos, a new clarity surfaced. The truth of years of denial, entitlement, and unspoken pain lay bare. Their panic was real, their losses palpable, but so was my resolve. I was no longer the invisible glue holding the family's broken pieces together. I was the catalyst forcing the truth into the light. Their silence in response to my silence spoke volumes. It was a boundary made manifest, a message that respect, honesty, and accountability were non-negotiable. The family stood at a crossroads: confront what they had become or continue down the path of denial and destruction. And as the days stretched on, I felt a complex mix of sorrow and strength. Sorrow for the family I had loved and lost, and strength from the knowledge that I had reclaimed my voice and my power. The story was far from over. It was only beginning. The weeks that followed the package at their door unfolded with a strange, uneasy rhythm. The family, once so certain of their grip on our lives, finally came face to face with a truth they could no longer dismiss or evade. For the first time, the illusion of unquestioned loyalty and blind forgiveness began to crack under the weight of consequences. Respect and accountability, words that had hovered on the edges of our conversations but were never enforced, became the new, uncompromising terms of engagement. I remember the first call from my mother after those frantic missed calls dried up. Her voice was quieter, more tentative, as if she were testing the waters, trying to find a way back without repeating the mistakes of the past. "Hermione," she said softly, "we want to make things right. Please, let's start over." But I had spent too many years trying to repair what was never truly whole. I replied calmly, choosing my words carefully. "Mom, this can only work if there's honesty and respect. No more silence about the hurt. No more enabling. It was a boundary. Yes, a line drawn not in anger but in self-preservation. Miranda's attempts were more volatile. She oscillated between desperate pleas and sharp accusations, as if caught in a storm of her own making. One moment, she'd text, "We're family. We can fix this." And the next, she'd lash out with, "You've betrayed us all." I read these messages with a detached clarity, refusing to be pulled back into cycles of manipulation. My response was firm and brief. "Get out. Now." Those words, once shouted at me in a moment of cruelty, were now mine to wield as a boundary and a declaration. It was a reversal of power, a reclaiming of control. Setting these boundaries wasn't easy. Each refusal to engage on old terms felt like reopening wounds I had barely begun to heal. There were moments of doubt, nights when I questioned whether I was too harsh, whether family was supposed to weather storms without drawing lines. But deep inside, I knew that tolerating abuse and erasure was not love. It was acquiescence to cruelty. With that clarity, I formalized the conditions for any future contact. Conversations had to be rooted in honesty, free from blame games and silent treatments. Accountability was non-negotiable. Any attempt to gaslight or manipulate would result in immediate disengagement, and respect had to be mutual, not a one-sided demand. I communicated this not only in words, but through actions, declining invitations to events where old patterns persisted, refusing to answer calls that carried bitterness or denial, and limiting contact to moments when real dialogue and change were possible. In parallel, I nurtured my chosen family, the people who had stood beside me through the storm. Ethan's unwavering support was my anchor. He never asked me to forgive prematurely or to sacrifice my dignity for peace. Julia, with her quiet strength, grew more confident, freed from the burden of watching me absorb pain silently. Together, we rebuilt our home into a sanctuary, filled with laughter, honest conversations, and above all, respect. It was a peace born not from avoidance, but from truth and boundaries. I found myself slowly letting go of the old narrative, the one where family meant unconditional acceptance of pain and invisibility. Instead, I embraced a new truth. Family loyalty is not blind. It is earned through respect, kindness, and accountability. The Chambers family had to choose their path forward. Whether they would grow and heal or remain trapped in denial and dysfunction was no longer my burden to carry. There were moments when I caught glimpses of change, small, hesitant apologies, genuine attempts to listen, but I no longer rushed to fill the silence or smooth the rough edges. The power to repair or to walk away rested with them. I had reclaimed my voice, and with it, my peace. These new boundaries transformed not only our family dynamic, but also how I saw myself. I was no longer the invisible caretaker, the silent victim, or the shadow behind Miranda's spotlight. I was a woman who had faced betrayal and chosen dignity over denial, who had demanded respect when none was offered freely. And in doing so, I had opened a door, not just for myself, but for Julia, for Ethan, and for anyone who learns that love without respect is no love at all. The story of the Chambers family is far from settled, but for me, the chapter that began with pain and betrayal has evolved into one of strength, clarity, and unwavering boundaries. The table where battles once raged now holds a promise, not of forgotten wounds, but of honest reckonings, and the hope that respect can one day replace silence.